and welcome to my first video on how to paint this new version of Marneus Calgar for the Ultramarines. So this version is plastic and he also comes with two heads. I've decided to go for the helmeted version, mainly because it's the first time he's ever worn a helmet in any of his model iterations. So I've started off and I've glued all the model together apart from the backpack and the head, and you can just see underneath the head there's a little bit of blue tack holding the head on, so that'll allow me to take the head out and paint that at some point during the process. But just to start with, I've got it all held together, and this will allow me to paint the all the rough marks down first, so it'll help to keep the lighting consistent, because sometimes if you paint pieces individually and then you, without taking into account how the light works on the whole model, they don't always match up. So I'm starting off with heavy blue. It's an extra opaque blue paint from Vallejo. It's a game colour. I've mentioned before I'm not overly keen on the game colour range. They tend to be a little bit more shiny and separate more easily than the standard model colour, but because it's an extra opaque colour, it works really nicely. It actually works very similar to the model colour range. And the main reason that I've used it is because it makes very strong marks. It's they're heavy pigment paints. So you can see as I'm applying the paint on the model there, the marks are very opaque. The clue being in the title of the paint, extra opaque, I guess. So yeah, while I'm applying the paint, I'm looking at how the light's hitting the model. I'm not going entirely on how the light's hitting it. I'm going to do a few pieces that are wrong, in quotes, just to make it more interesting, so I can change the focal point of some of the highlights in places, just to make it look more interesting. But so for this video we're going to be mainly looking at the front of the model and just blocking in all the colours and things like that. But the whole series will cover painting the entirety of the model. It won't be every single paint stroke, because that will be probably around about 15 hours or more, I'd guess. And that's too long for a video. But I'm going to show you techniques for all of the sections on it, so you'll be able to at least carry over the techniques onto all of the areas. So if you look at how I'm applying the paint, it's very rough. And I just want to clarify, when I say rough, people sometimes get the wrong impression, as if there's it's like saying that it's not applied well, but no, it's just a style as such. It's a reason I'm applying it this way, because of the end result having the kind of textured look showing through. If I was, and if you've seen the finished photo that I posted, you'll see that there's a lot of texture on the armour. So rough isn't a judgment on the quality of the painting so much as just obviously what the paint looks like. And also when I say rough, I mean in the fact that you can see the black primer and different layers through it. I don't mean rough in that the paint is thick, because that would just, unless there's a specific reason that you're using thick paint for texture, it looks pretty horrible. But anyway, you can see as I'm applying the paint, I'm doing it in kind of, I like to use the term controlled chaos. So you're getting kind of random marks, but in a way where you want those marks to be. So you can see all over where I've applied the blue paint so far that you can see kind of scratchy marks and the black primer showing through. And also, for those interested, the primer was applied with an airbrush, and it's Vallejo black surface primer. For the high contrast of this model to work, you do need a very dark primer to start with. You can't paint this over a white primer. You won't get the marks. So one of the nice things about this type of painting as well is that it really doesn't matter if you're getting paint on sections of the model that shouldn't have the paint on. So you can see I've got little paint marks that catch things like on the power cable that goes under the power fist on the right of the screen, or just little marks all over. They can all be tidied up as you go along, and the speed that you can apply the paint because of using this technique far outweighs the fact that you've just got to tidy up a few areas at the end. But don't just go completely mad and just get blue paint all over it, because obviously that'll make your life harder when it comes to tidying it up and making it look neater at the end. But don't worry too much. Like if you're painting in a mark and you just catch the bolt gun or whatever, it really doesn't matter. But while taking that into account, that's mainly relevant for this first stage when painting the armour. Once you get onto painting some of the smaller areas, say like the chest eagle or the shoulder eagle, where the non-metallic gold colours, if you are too haphazard with how you apply the paint then, and you get some on the blue, then it's much harder to fix. So it only really works for being really sketchy on the first colour that you're applying. And after that you have to be a bit more careful, because it's still not the end of the world, but it just makes it harder to fix. And because I'm using this technique for speed, you're just slowing yourself down by making mistakes that need to be fixed later on. And so all of the paint that I've applied has tried to be kind of consistent with the lighting while still filling in the armour blocks, the block colours on the armour, so that enough of it's blue to make it look blue. So it's highlight points but expanded out and round further than the light would suggest, because what I usually say is to hold the model under a lamp and you can see how the light hits all the areas. But because you need to highlight this up further, you need the blue to be much more spread out than the light is just catching if you hold it under the lamp, because you want the arm to look blue. Now you could do it so it was just smaller areas, and that would make it really high contrast. It would look interesting as well, and it would be even faster to paint, but that's not the look I'm going for on this. I want the armour to be quite clearly blue by the time I'm finished. So you can see there I'm just very roughly picking out some of the details on the helmet. But again, the helmet is only blue tacked in, so I can take the helmet off of the model and spend more time on it. But this will allow me to just get the paint marks down, so I've got a rough plan on how I want all the lighting to look at the end. So the first two videos of this series are going to be looking at mainly the front of the model. So don't worry if you're going along and you think, oh, he's only painting the front of the model. The whole model will be completed by the end of the series, including the base as well. But I just wanted to, because I had to paint this model quite quickly to get it a near enough finished photo for the pre-order date, I wanted to do a very, very fast effect, and I didn't want to worry too much about the back of it because you can't see that in the photo. But the whole thing will be finished in the video series. There's not that much to see on the back anyway, it's mostly the cloak and the backpack. So you can see here where I'm painting the blue in still on the foot. I'm putting in extra marks, so it's not just filling in the area, but I'm putting in these little chunky lines and things, and that works kind of as additional lighting and texture and all sorts of things, just to make it visually interesting. All these marks is kind of a trick to hide the fact that I'm not doing smooth blending. So it's to make it look interesting, and it's sort of detail that you're adding, and that detail disguises the fact that there's not a very nice transition, because painting very smooth transitions takes a lot longer than just scrubbing on the paint, getting some texture marks down. But the nice thing is that once you've got all these marks, you can spend a long time on this model if you wanted to. Obviously it's a nice model, it's a centerpiece model, so once you've got all these, by the end of the videos where I've finished, you can then spend longer on the model if you wanted, just glazing over, just doing very refined marks and things like that, and it will still retain all the marks that you've got to make it look interesting, but you can make it super neat as well. So there is always that option, whereas if you did something that was a perfectly smooth transition, it's a lot more scary to start putting textures and things on top of that when you've spent hours, getting those really nice finishes. So just so you are clear, the paint in the top right of the wet palette, that's the extra opaque heavy blue. I'll move on to the highlight when we get there. What you might find on this model is that there are a lot of small arm panels. It's quite a complex model actually. Originally I planned out the paint scheme before I got the model, and I just assumed he'd be like a Space Marine, basically. Primary Space Marines are quite simply shaped, and I'd already painted the Raven Guard Primaris Marine, so I thought this technique would work quite nicely on that. But he's a little bit more complex in his in his designs. He's got all these, he's got all the iconography sculpted all over him and things like that. So if you were painting this technique, say, on a standard Space Marine model, it will be a lot quicker and easier, whereas on this one you have to obviously jump around a little bit and take your time more. So if you just want to use this on your standard Marines, it's probably an even better technique for those than on something like this. So I've started painting in the base colour on the chest eagle, and well, basically all the non-metallics, and so the three colours are, I've swapped out one of my standard colours from the non-metallics. Usually I use Japanese uniform. I've swapped it out for heavy ochre, which is again an extra opaque paint from Vallejo. It's quite similar really to Japanese uniform, but it's just a little bit more yellow, so it makes it brighter, which will contrast nicely with the blue. But the base colour that I'm painting on at the moment is English uniform. So you can see in the top left of the wet palette we've got English uniform, heavy ochre, and there's ice yellow, although we won't be getting to the heavy ochre and ice yellow just yet because I'm still blocking in all the base colours. It's usually when I paint models, I don't block in the whole of the model with colours first because I find it quite boring. It's a very sensible thing to do because it allows you to balance the colours over the model, and I would recommend if you're painting a model, if you're painting a model, to block in the colours first because, as I said, you have more control and you can just see how everything works much more easily, and you're less likely to make a mistake when you're highlighting and shading, for the colour balances. And so really I should do that, which is why I'm doing it in this video, but I do tend to find that it's a bit boring because the first stage of blocking colours is so tedious. There's no, you're just putting flat colours down, but I thought I'd try blocking in the whole model with using this technique because it's much more exciting getting all these colours down, and it's really quick. So yeah, if you wanted to try blocking in all the colours and like me you find it boring, this is it's not as bad doing it this way. You may have noticed when I started painting the chest eagle that the paint was a little bit watery. What has happened is that I haven't shaken the paint quite enough, so there's more medium than pigment in there, but I'm not too bothered about it really. Because I'm just slapping the early base colours down, but so you can see how it's not making completely opaque marks, whereas it really should be quite close to that, but it's just a case of them doing more layers and things. Also, I'm not worried about the finish because I'm going to be covering the model in AK Interactive Ultra Matte varnish at the end, and the reason for that is, well, you see more in the video as you go along, but what happens at the moment is because the dark is shiny, it makes it really, really high contrast. I'm going to mention this in the next videos as well because it becomes even more apparent the further along we get. But you'll see that the black will stand out really strongly because there's quite a high tonal jump between the blue and the black, and having the black, well, it's not really shiny, it's kind of satin, but it makes, like I said, the tonal change between the colours really high, whereas once I put the AK Interactive Ultra Matte down, it stops everything being shiny, so you just work then on the colours, and it makes it, it also gives it the really nice painterly effect, so it actually looks like a painting. So the plan was, when I was painting this, I wanted it to look like the artwork. I don't mean like the artwork in the colours, I mean in the style. So if you look at some of the artwork, you can always see the paint marks and things like that, if it's a traditional painting generally. Even the digital ones, people artificially put paint marks in there because it looks more interesting. So I was purposefully wanting to put in the paint marks, but I didn't want it to just look really kind of lazily painted. So the AK Interactive really helps with that, the Ultra Matte, because then you're just focusing on the brush marks and the colours, and you're not letting the shininess of the paint interrupt what you're seeing. So here you can see I'm using the heavy ochre. It's a really nice colour, and you can see how it instantly pops right out against the blue next to it. on the non-metallics on this, say compared to the other non-metallics that I've been doing. So obviously these are a lot rougher in the brush marks. They're not nice and smooth or anything like that, but the contrast that I'm using, the tonal contrast, I'm using an awful lot of dark area on the areas that I want to be metallic. You just see a bit there where I went onto the rope on the front of his chest again. So that's just going back to where I was saying you don't worry too much about catching other areas of the model with the paint. But yeah, so the non-metallics are really high contrast. There's lots of areas of dark and just small areas of highlight on them, particularly on things like this eagle on the leg. I'm going to put a photo of the finished model at the end of the video so you can check that. I've also posted one on Patreon anyway, so you've probably already seen it, but if you look at the picture carefully, you'll see on the non-metallics, especially the ones lower down, there's not much paint on them. There's some of the details picked out, but there's like one or two spots where the highlights are really bright, and it represents that the light's not really strong down on the lower section. It's again pushing your eye up, focusing more towards the head. So you see this area where I'm painting now, on the shoulder pad, it's much brighter, and so it's keeping your eye towards the head of the model. So on the light point here on the chest, I've tweaked it a little bit. For most of the lighting on the model, I've got it coming slightly from the upper left, but because if you do just one light point on a model and you turn it around, it always it looks wrong if you look at it from different angles. But I wanted this to look it looks correct from one angle, roughly correct anyway, but the chest and the head, I've got the lighting slightly more to the front, just so that it focuses more towards that kind of point. I wanted the centre of the model with the head to really pop out more. So if you've seen the previous video on Mortarion, he's got one of these things that's very similar. It's an iron halo. I'm not entirely sure why Mortarion has one of those, but on this version, now obviously Mortarion's painted to a display type standard, whereas this isn't really. This is more of a gaming piece. Maybe a slightly higher level gaming piece, but that kind of thing anyway. And so you can see that I'm not bothering to smooth these colours in too much. Now towards the end they will be smoothed in more, but there's still going to be all these textures and the transparency of the paint, and you will be able to see the primer still on the model. But it still works, the non-metallics will still work, and that's because of the high contrast. And I can't stress this enough. If you want to make something really shiny and pop out, you need that high contrast. So here I'm just painting in the chest with Vallejo heavy red. Again, I'm going to give options for Games Workshop paints. It's not quite as easy to give perfect colour matches, especially for the heavy blue, but you'll be able to get very close, and it doesn't matter too much if it's not a perfect match, because you can glaze colours over and things like that. As long as it looks blue, it'll be fine. I mean, there's lots of layers on here anyway, and there's going to be grey colours painted on as well, so don't worry too much about it. And here I'm just painting in the first base colour for the leather strips. This is Mournfang Brown. So I'm not painting the leather strips quite the same style as the excuse me, as the armour. The armour is much looser in style. So it's important to remember when you're painting with this technique and you want it to look painterly and things like that, there's still a little bit of variation that you can fit in there to make different surfaces, different textures on the model stand out. So I don't want the leather straps looking the same as the armour, whereas I still want that kind of loose feel to it. It would just look, you know, it would look more messy and unrefined if you just paint everything the same way. So the leather is going to be, while still having looser marks, the marks will be more specifically applied to make it look separate. We'll get to that. That'll be in the next video. But still, even in this one, you can see that the brown, as it's applied there, isn't quite as kind of random, that chaotic, controlled chaos as the blue armour. So what I'm just doing here quickly, actually, is using heavy blue-grey. Again, another extra opaque colour to paint in the white areas. Now, you might notice on the knee, I'd started painting that blue. I then checked on the box that the model came with and noticed that actually his knee was supposed to be white. And to paint white, I don't actually paint the areas white, because that doesn't give you any area to highlight up. It just makes your life a bit harder. So if you use, well, let's say I've gone for heavy blue-grey. That allows me to highlight upwards, so I can then easily put spot highlights on, but it's not so bright that it's hard to shade down as well. So if I want to put some more shadow in the bottom areas and things like that, it's not too bad. So there, the Ultra symbol on his Iron Halo looks very, very messy at the moment. Now, all the Ultra symbols that are painted on him, I decided, again, in this video, this is more of all the base work, but by the end of the video, not this, the future videos, those will look a bit more neatly done, because again, as I was talking about the variations in texture, on the model, I thought it would look better if these were just a little bit neater, so they'll be blended in. There's not going to be any glazing on them. They'll still have that kind of slight rough look, but there's just more time spent on them than some of the other areas of the model, especially because they stand out being so bright compared to some of the darker areas. So these are all non-metallic, I suppose it's steel, really light steel, and these all the metal areas are just painted in at this stage roughly with the heavy blue-grey. So another thing that I was considering while painting the model was that I didn't want to have to keep changing the paints too often. So I've tended to use colours that if they're on the palette and they're close enough, rather than having to always pick specific colours, and so then I'll just try and make them work with what's on the palette as I go along. So these, I think they're purity. Well, this is a purity seal anyway, and the thing next to it that ends in another Ultra symbol with a skull in it. They look like they're supposed to be paper anyway. So the colour, I used the heavy ochre, and then the heavy red for the purity symbol wax seal. But this is just to show that you can use the same colours and get different results. So the paper effect is using one of the same colours as the non-metallic gold, but because it doesn't have the English uniform base, and it's going to be highlighted up much lighter at the end with white, even though the non-metallic gold will have white on it as well, it'll still look very different. So on the barrels of the bolters, you can see I paint these separate straight lines going down. You have one kind of direct highlight line and then some secondary highlight lines near them. These are just random marks to show reflections. You can see there I've got a mark on the edge of the armour. But it doesn't matter too much. So again, heavy blue grey, just painting in the grill on the intake on his backpack. Somebody mentioned it's a bit weird that he has intakes on the front of his backpack because it's not a jump pack, and the intakes are actually for jump packs. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. It doesn't look like he's got a jump pack if you look on the rear of his armour, but I'm guessing it's some sort of cooling system maybe, I don't know. So now it's time for the first layer highlight onto the blue, and this is I think Lothern Blue. Yeah. Oh, I mean the paints obviously will be in the description at the end, so if I've got anything wrong I'll make sure that's clear in the description, but I'm pretty sure this is Lothern Blue. Now these highlights will go on, and they're just so when you painted the first heavy blue marks down, they should all work as your guide for where all the future highlights will go. This stage of the highlight is then to refine those areas, just to, well, you're doing two things. One, you're obviously highlighting, so you're making the areas more shiny, but this is where you then focus more on making certain areas stand out more, so they can be areas of visual interest and focal points on the model. So here you can see I'm going straight to white. It's P3 Morrow white, which is my personal favourite white, but feel free to use any other white you like. Especially in this case, because the AK Interactive matte varnish at the end well, ultra matte. I've got to make that super clear. It's ultra matte varnish, not a standard matte. Will take away most of the variations. Usually, what you find is different paints have various properties and can result in a different finish from matte to satin to gloss. Obviously, the ultra matte varnish takes away all those variations and just levels all the variation in roughness out. And you can see all of these highlights will focus more on the edges of armour and sharp details and curves, whereas there won't be that much in the way of marks on flat areas too much, unless it's an upper flat area near the head, to again create extra contrast at that point to make the focal point more in that area. Basically, it's brightening up that bit. So you can see as well, at this stage of the highlight, it's really slowed down the paintbrush marks. If you go back to the beginning of the video and you see how the first stage was applied with the heavy blue, how quickly all the marks were applied on there, there was a lot less thought given to how the brush marks were applied. By this stage, you really don't want to be getting the paint marks all over the model. You want to be much more controlled with how you do them. But the idea is here using not too many brush marks, so you're still keeping the marks blocky, but just more controlled than before. You need to be able to take your time to pick out the details. Now, some of these marks will be changed as it goes along. It's still kind of the underpainting stage at this point. There will be more and more layers added as we go along, including some glazes. So don't panic too much if you get if you go really wrong and you put a big blob of paint down and be like, oh, that's completely the wrong colour. As long as you haven't put the paint down too thickly, you can still work with it. You can see here on the Power Fist how I'm trying to get the top curve brighter, so it makes it stand out. Again, top half of the model being brighter than the lower half. See, there's a lot more highlight on the Power Fist area than there is on the leg. Also, when making these kind of marks and things, if you look at the tip of my brush, it looks nice and neat, but it is worn down slightly. It's a what was it? Size. I think it's a size 1, so it's an Artisoprus brush, but it's one that I've used for quite a while now. So the very, very sharp tip has vanished, whereas the brush is still fine. It's perfectly good to use, but it doesn't have the super fine tip for doing the very fine details and marks. Now, sometimes people will swap their brushes at that point. I often do, but I don't throw away my brush either, because different brushes with you can use to make different marks. So you can see here when I apply the marks, it leaves a thicker line using the tip of the brush, which is really helpful in this situation for doing these blocked in kind of areas. And it's also important to note that just by having a larger brush, you won't achieve the same result. If you went and got a brand new size 2 brush and tried to do this, you still have that very fine new brush tip on it. So unless you want to buy a brush and cut the tip off, and I just mean the very, very sharp tip, which would be a waste, I instead recommend that you keep your brushes as they wear down, and then what I actually do is I colour code the ends of each brush. You won't be able to see it in the video, but I dip each brush in a different colour so that I know how old it is. So then, without having to check each tip of the brush, I know that, oh, that's an older brush. I can make a fatter mark with the tip of it, just because I've had it longer and it's worn down more. I've been getting a lot of questions as well about the model holder that I have. I'm sure I've mentioned it before in videos, but it's Wrathcore model holder. If you just Google the name, it'll be the first thing that comes up. Rathcore. I backed them on the Kickstarter when they first came out. You can get a few different model holders on the market, but I prefer this one. It's just really nice and ergonomic with my hands. And the point of them is that you can hold the model without touching the model. So usually if you hold a model, you'll be putting your fingers right now on top of the spikes to hold it, which 1 is uncomfortable and 2 damages the paintwork. Whereas now I can hold the top of the model on that little tiny skull thing without touching the model, so it just makes it really easy to move around. There you can see my finger on the top. And just a quick note as well, the highlights on the front of the chest on his little neck armour, those are all facing to the left again. So some of the highlights don't quite line up perfectly because the highlight on his face is more in the centre, and on the chest eagle is kind of to the centre as well. But I wanted the highlights on the neck armour to be more to the left because then that allows me to create again that high contrast with the shadows to the right of them, and it just makes things stand out nicely. Always having light next to dark works well. As long as I keep the general lighting consistent, I don't think it matters too much. So I'm just using straight white now on the highlights, but this isn't the final stage. Usually what happens, by the time you get to using white on your highlights, that will be the final stage, and then you're done with the armour, or whatever it is you're painting. By the white highlight, that's it, that's the final stage, and then that's it. On this case, this is the final stage of the base layer. And you're going to be going back, and this is when the refining starts. Hopefully what you'll find by all these quick marks that you've put down is that you're going to get, to steal a Bob Ross phrase, happy accidents. And what these are things that you don't intend but you're hoping for, and they just look really nice on the model. So they're just interesting marks, basically. So now going into these purity seals, just going on straight away with white highlight over the top of the heavy ochre. And again, some white on the chest eagle at the front, just to really punch through on the contrast. Same again on the shoulder. And then as we go further down, the highlight dots are smaller and smaller, while still keeping that high contrast, so there's less light overall hitting them, which just basically means that there's less other colours, or fewer other colours, and less highlight. See here, I'm just picking out small details, which are the sharp points on these, so it's a wreath on this leg. I've actually realised I've made a mistake on the colours. It's not Morrow white, it's ivory. It's not a massive difference. You probably were looking at the palette and thinking that white paint looks a little bit gone off. Yeah, so it's model colour ivory. And I've used that on the armour as well. Everywhere that is white has had ivory applied. Excuse me. And that has just added a small amount of warmth to the model. It's not going to make a massive difference if you use white or ivory, but now that I think about it, I used ivory because it's a model colour, so it's got slightly heavier pigment. So again, it makes very strong marks when you apply it. I'm just picking out the skull in the centre. There's also a skull that I actually miss on the final photo. On the purity seal that goes all the way down has a U at the bottom of it. There's a skull in the centre. If you look at the finished photo that I posted, I missed the skull, so you can still see that it's not a finished model in the final photo. don't worry about these marks, I changed these afterwards. So I started off, I was putting heavy ochre down. I was going to use those as highlights on the red cords that go across his chest to hold in. I'm not sure what they hold on actually, but I decided later on not to go with the heavy ochre highlights, and I just highlight them as bright red. So ignore that part for the time being, and just keep that as heavy red, as flat heavy red. So here I'm just picking out the ribbing. I guess these are the flexible joint bits on the inside of the armour. And I'm painting these as in the same way as the metal, like on the gun barrels. So this is just heavy blue-grey again, which will then be highlighted with ivory. And the ivory is just a little dot on the very top. This is the top highlight. So as I said, it's the highest highlight on this model at the moment is ivory, but it's very pale. Obviously ivory is a light colour, so white would be fine as well. So this is the final model, the final photo. This is what we'll be aiming towards. The next video will get us a little bit closer to this, and then there'll be a couple more following that. But anyway, this is the end of the first video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.